Welcome to the next module. Nope, the next segment in module one. We're still in module one. Moving right along though. So let's talk a little bit about storing our data and comparing spreadsheets versus databases. So in a spreadsheet, kind of all of the information gets stored into this one spreadsheet. And so we kind of refer that as a flat file because of that. It's just one large spreadsheet, one large table, essentially. And so what a relational database does is it takes that really large table, that one single table, and it breaks it up into smaller, unique tables. And we do that by the entities, right? And then we create different characteristics or different attributes about each one of those entities. And so again, each attribute of that entity is what we refer to as a column attribute, and they're kind of interchangeable. And so each row essentially within that table is a record of that entity. And then the relationship is how we tie those two entities, those two tables together, right? And so we do that through those attributes, through those columns, right? So essentially, we're going to have a column, an attribute in one table that also exists in another table. And that's how we're going to tie those two tables together. And that's how we create the relationship. For example, if we look at the entities, clients and projects, right? The client table is going to have the attribute of client ID, right? That's going to identify the client. But that column, that attribute or that field, right? All three of those are kind of synonymous, also exist in that projects table, right? And so that's how we tie those two together. So when you're using a flat file like a spreadsheet, they're going to be oftentimes because all the data is just all lumped into this one table, there's going to be situations where you have like multiple entries for, a single column or a single field. And that can create a lot of issues, a lot of organizational issues and issues retrieving the data that you want and things like that. And so databases eliminate that when you properly create that relationship between the different entities. And so by doing that, we're essentially breaking down the list so that each entity, each table has a unique set of attributes. In that, when you retrieve a specific field or a specific column or attribute from a specific record inside of that table, you're only going to get, a single answer, right? Which is essentially what we want. And so what databases do is they break down that list, that one massive collective list, into those separate tables, separate entities, right? So that we can kind of get those unique answers that we want. And that's through a process that we call normalization. And we're going to talk more about that later on. But if you're looking at your database and you're looking at the entities in there and the tables, and if you see any of these warning signs, if any of them apply, then you know that you can kind of break down the database into even more tables to make it even more unique and create those relationships that are needed, creating more organized data structure. And so those warning signs are needing to enter more than one value in a particular field, being asked to fill in more than one piece of information in a field when you're doing the data entry. If you're asked to enter both the value and the unit of measurement into the same field, right? That's kind of piggybacking off that, entering more than one piece of information into a field. And then if you have to add additional columns to kind of handle all of those situations with multiple values in your table. So those are the warning signs. If you see any of those, or if you notice that your database, if any of those apply to your database, then you can break it down even further so that each of your tables contain that unique entity and those attributes related to it. So that's been a lot of talking about databases and what they are, but we also have a way to visually represent them, which is so much more helpful. Being able to kind of see the relationships and see the entities and the tables and the things like that, it's going to make it just make much more sense to you guys when you see that. And we're going to take a look at that here in just a second. But that representation that we see, that visualization, is what we refer to as an entity relationship diagram, E-R or ERD. And it's just that. It's just a way to visually look at the database and kind of really get a holistic picture of all of the data and how it all ties together and the different relationships within the tables. So you're going to see different, boxes, different rectangles, and those represent the different tables, the different entities. And then you're going to see some kind of lines that are connecting the different boxes together. Those are the relationships between those different tables. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have, like one-to-many relationships. And so when you see the number one on one end of the line, that indicates obviously the one part of it. And then the many part of it is going to be represented by an infinity symbol. So when you see one on one end and the infinity on the other, that's a one-to-many relationship. So let's take a look at one. Right here. Here we have, our ERD for our JC Consulting Company. We can see our different tables there. We have our clients entity, our projects entity, project line items, task master list, and employees entity. So these are all the different tables that we have. And so underneath the table name, right, underneath each entity, clients, projects, employees, are the different attributes, or different fields, or different columns, whichever one you want to refer to them as. But these are the characteristics of each of those entities. And so you can see how we have attributes in one table that also exist in other tables, right? So if we look at this first one here of client ID, we can see that client ID also exists in projects. And so in the clients table, that client ID, there's only going to be one unique ID per record, right? We're only going to have client ID 1 and client ID 31, right? You're not going to have it in there multiple times. So there's that one part of the relationship. In projects, however, if we look at the projects table here, right now we're listing out all the different projects by the project ID. So the project ID is going to be the unique characteristic for this table. It's going to identify each specific record, right? Project ID 27, so on and so forth. But different projects could belong to the same client, right? So project 31, project 27, project 48, all belong to client ID 12, right? Because that client has all three of those projects going on at the same time. So that's how we create that one-to-many relationship. All right, so there's the ERD, the ER diagram. Again, I think it just kind of ties everything together really nicely, gives you a better understanding of databases and how we separate them into these different tables, and then we create relationships between those tables, and that's how we kind of tie all this data together. So I hope this has been beneficial, and we'll see you in the next segment.